Journalism is supposed to protect people. But for the 10 people on this list, the stories they uncovered didn't protect them. The reporting got them killed. These are the journalists who knew too much. Case 1. Michael Hastings. It's 4:20 in the morning on June 18, 2013. Hancock Park, Los Angeles. Quiet residential streets, tall palm trees lining the median, the kind of neighborhood where a fatal car crash almost never happens. And a silver Mercedes C250 is tearing through it at roughly 100 miles per hour. A surveillance camera outside Pizzeria Mota on Melrose and Highland catches the car a few hundred feet before the end. The Mercedes blows through a red light, no hesitation, no brake lights visible. Seconds later, it slams into a palm tree on Highland Avenue, and the car doesn't just crash, it explodes. The fireball is so intense that neighbors who rush outside can't get anywhere near it. The wreckage keeps detonating. And the engine, a massive block of metal that Mercedes designed to drop downward and away from the driver on impact, somehow launches roughly 100 feet down the street. A Mercedes dealer in Long Beach later told reporters, the car has a crumble zone. When it crashes, it goes in like an accordion. In some cases, the engine drops down so it doesn't go into you. That's the engineering. Engines don't fly 100 feet from the car. Cars built like that don't explode like incendiary devices, but this one did. The driver was identified through fingerprints 2 days later because the body was burned beyond recognition. His name was Michael Hastings. He was 33 years old, and to call him one of the most dangerous investigative journalists in America is not an exaggeration. To understand why, you have to go back 3 years. In June 2010, Rolling Stone magazine published a cover story called The Runaway General. Hastings had spent weeks embedded with General Stanley McChrystal, the commander of all U.S. and NATO forces in Afghanistan. And what he brought back was devastating. McChrystal and his inner circle captured on the record, openly mocking the Obama administration, dismissing the vice president, ridiculing the civilian leadership they answered to. The piece was a grenade. Within days of publication, McChrystal was recalled to Washington and resigned. One article. One reporter who grew up between New York, Canada, and Vermont went to NYU and started covering Iraq for Newsweek at 25. Ended a 4-star general running the war. Hastings won a George Polk Award for it. Rolling Stone later called him hard-charging and unabashedly opinionated. Brad Pitt played a fictionalized version of McChrystal in a Netflix film based on Hastings' follow-up book, The Operators. And every powerful figure in the national security establishment absorbed the same lesson at the same time. Michael Hastings does not play the access game, he does not trade favors, he does not protect sources in exchange for future access. He publishes what he sees. If you let him in the room, everything you say in that room goes on the record. That made him the single most unwelcome journalist in Washington. Not hated, exactly. Feared. Now, jump to the summer of 2013. Hastings is living in LA. He'd recently moved from New York to open BuzzFeed's Los Angeles bureau, and he's working on his next big target. His widow, Elise Jordan, confirmed on CNN that Hastings had been writing an expose on CIA Director John Brennan for Rolling Stone. The piece was supposed to run within weeks. Brennan wasn't some mid-level bureaucrat. He was Obama's former counterterrorism advisor, now running the CIA. A San Diego 6 News reporter, Kimberly Dvorak, said she received an email from the CIA acknowledging Hastings was working on a CIA story. And a Stratfor email published by WikiLeaks, an internal memo from the CIA-connected private security firm, named Brennan specifically as the person behind what it called the witch hunts of investigative journalists who published material critical of the administration. The email said there was a specific tasker from the White House to go after anyone printing materials negative to the Obama agenda. It added, even the FBI is shocked. So think about where Hastings was sitting. He'd already destroyed a general's career with one story. Now he was digging into the director of the CIA, a man who allegedly had White House authorization to target reporters. And in the days before his death, Hastings was scared. Not cautious, scared. On June 17, 2013, at 12:56 in the afternoon, about 16 hours before the crash, Hastings sent an email to his colleagues at BuzzFeed. The text has been published. It reads, "Hey, the feds are interviewing my close friends and associates. Perhaps if the authorities arrive, BuzzFeed HQ may be wise to immediately request legal counsel before any conversations or interviews about our news gathering practices or related journalism issues. Also, I'm onto a big story and need to go off the radar for a bit." He signed it. "All the best, and hope to see you all soon." Hastings sent that to BuzzFeed editors, but also blind copied his friend, Staff Sergeant Joe Biggs, a soldier he'd met while embedded in Afghanistan. Biggs later told reporters that the moment he read the email, his whole body was shaking. He had goosebumps. He knew something was wrong. Around the same time, Hastings contacted WikiLeaks lawyer Jennifer Robinson to tell her the FBI was investigating him. WikiLeaks tweeted this the day after his death, and it set off an immediate firestorm. The FBI responded by breaking its own policy of neither confirming nor denying investigations. The Bureau issued a public statement. At no time was journalist Michael Hastings under investigation by the FBI. But that denial didn't hold. In 2013, Vice News journalist Jason Leopold and MIT doctoral candidate Ryan Shapiro filed a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit against the FBI. When the documents finally came back, they showed the Bureau had files on Hastings connected to his controversial reporting. Internal FBI emails obtained through the lawsuit showed officials scrambling to craft a statement about the case, with one email reading, "We are getting ready to push out a statement to the press ruling out any investigation and want to ensure no info yet to be entered into the system surfaces after the fact." The FBI had been tracking him. Their public denial was worded carefully enough to be technically defensible while being functionally misleading. They said he wasn't under investigation. Their own files said he was on their radar for his reporting. And then there's the detail that keeps me up at night. Hours before the crash, Hastings showed up at his neighbor Jordana Thigpen's apartment in LA and urgently asked to borrow her Volvo. He told her he believed his own car had been tampered with. He said he was afraid to drive his Mercedes and wanted to leave town. Let that land for a second. This is a man who spent years in actual war zones, Afghanistan, Iraq. He embedded with combat units and filed stories under fire. In 2007, his fiancée Andrea Parhamovich, who was working for the National Democratic Institute in Baghdad, was killed when her convoy was ambushed. Hastings wrote his first book, I Lost My Love in Baghdad, about losing her. He poured his grief into the work and went right back to the war after the book came out. His BuzzFeed editor, Ben Smith, called him a great fearless journalist. His friend Cenk Uygur said he wore his heart on his sleeve and gave you everything he had. Everyone who knew him used the same word, fearless. And this same man, a combat veteran of the most dangerous beats in American journalism, is standing in a neighbor's doorway asking for the keys to somebody else's Volvo because he's too frightened to get into his own car. Hours later, he's behind the wheel of that same Mercedes at 4 a.m. doing 100 through a residential neighborhood, and the car explodes on impact in a way the manufacturer says shouldn't happen. The coroner's report came back in August 2013. Cause of death was massive blunt force trauma. Toxicology found trace amounts of amphetamine consistent with methamphetamine use hours before the crash and traces of marijuana. His family confirmed he had relapsed after 14 years of sobriety. 2 of his brothers were flying to LA that same morning to persuade him to enter detox. The death was ruled accidental. And that piece of the story is real. Hastings was struggling, his family confirmed it, but a relapse doesn't explain the physics. It doesn't explain an engine ejecting 100 feet from a car engineered to prevent exactly that. It doesn't explain a fireball intense enough to keep detonating, and it doesn't explain why a man who was terrified to drive his own car a few hours earlier is behind the wheel at 4 a.m. doing triple digits through a neighborhood. Former counterterrorism czar Richard Clarke, who served under both Bill Clinton and George W. Bush, told the Huffington Post that what happened to Hastings's car was consistent with a car cyber attack. He said intelligence agencies had the capability to remotely hack modern vehicle control systems. And 4 years later, in 2017, WikiLeaks released the Vault 7 files, a massive cache of CIA documents. Inside was confirmation that the agency had been researching how to infect vehicle control systems used by modern cars and trucks. The stated purpose, according to the documents, would permit the CIA to engage in nearly undetectable assassinations. The LAPD closed the case. No independent investigation was ever conducted. Nobody examined the vehicle's onboard computer systems. Nobody looked at the engine trajectory. Hastings's Brennan story ran posthumously in Rolling Stone, but whatever reporting he hadn't finished went with him into that fireball on Highland Avenue. And here's what I keep circling back to. This wasn't some reckless kid chasing clicks. Hastings had already paid the worst price a person can pay. He lost Parhamovich in Baghdad. She was 28. They were going to get married. He wrote an entire book about that grief, and the book is one of the most honest things a journalist has ever published about what war actually costs the people who cover it. And then he went right back into the most dangerous rooms in American power and kept doing the exact thing that made those rooms dangerous. He didn't do it for fame. His own editor said Hastings wrote stories that would otherwise have gone unwritten. He did it because he believed the public had a right to know what was being done in their name, and he did it knowing what it could cost because he had already been handed the bill once. The man who brought down a commanding general with one magazine article, who was investigating the director of the CIA, who emailed his colleagues that the feds were closing in, who begged a neighbor for a different car because he thought his own had been compromised. That man died alone on a residential street at 4:20 in the morning. In a crash, the car's own engineering was built to survive, and nobody in any position of authority has ever tried to explain the parts that don't add up. Michael Hastings was 33 years old. He was the kind of reporter who made generals sweat and intelligence chiefs lose sleep. And the night he told the world he was onto something big, he drove into the dark and never came back. Case 2. Alfredo Jiménez Mota. Saturday night, April 2nd, 2005. The city of Hermosillo in the northwestern Mexican state of Sonora, desert country about 170 miles south of the Arizona border. Sonora is the kind of place where the cartel economy runs parallel to the legal one, and everyone in town knows which businesses, which police chiefs, and which politicians belong to which side. The northern states of Mexico had already become one of the most dangerous places in Latin America for reporters to work. Journalists covering organized crime in this part of the country didn't get warnings from the cartels. They got bullets. And the ones who kept writing after the first warning tended to disappear. At 8:45 in the evening, a 25-year-old crime reporter named Alfredo Jiménez Mota walks out of the offices of El Imparcial, the biggest newspaper in Hermosillo. He calls his colleague Shyla Rosagal and tells her he'll meet up with her and some friends later that night after he finishes interviewing one of his contacts. He mentions that the contact is very nervous. The contact is Andrés Montoya García, Deputy Director of the Sonora State Prison System. The topic is the release of an alleged drug trafficker who went by the nickname El Estudiante. According to Montoya's later statement to police, the two met, talked about El Estudiante, and then Montoya dropped Jiménez Mota off at a supermarket around 10:30 p.m. Jiménez Mota never showed up to meet his friends. His cell phone records, which El Imparcial later obtained and examined, show the last call he received that night came in at 11:04 p.m. The caller was Raúl Fernando Rojas Galván, the deputy chief of the Mexican Attorney General's office in Sonora. That's not a low-level functionary. That's someone near the top of the state's law enforcement pyramid. When investigators first asked Rojas Galván about that call, he denied having seen or spoken to the journalist. He later retracted that denial and admitted the call happened, saying Jiménez Mota had called him for information. The records also showed Jiménez Mota made calls that night to a third number that the newspaper could not trace. Nobody has seen or heard from Alfredo Jiménez Mota since that night. He was 25 years old. Now, to understand why a 25-year-old reporter vanishes without a trace in a Mexican border state, you have to understand what he'd been writing. And what he'd been writing was getting him noticed by exactly the wrong people. Jiménez Mota covered organized crime and public security for El Imparcial. He'd only been at the paper for about 6 months, but before that he'd already broken stories on organized crime while working in the neighboring state of Coahuila. He was aggressive, he was ambitious, he was built like a fighter, 240 pounds, a former boxer. And within those 6 months at El Imparcial, he'd published a series titled Mafia and Sonora that exposed the collusion between Sonora's police forces and the drug trafficking organizations operating through the state, specifically the Beltran Leyva organization, known locally as Los Tres Caballeros, and the Enriquez Parra gang based out of the city of Alamos. But the story that made Jiménez Mota a target, the one that earned El Imparcial a National Journalism Prize, was a piece the paper called El Cuarto Pasajero, the fourth passenger. Here's what happened. On September 11, 2004, Sonora police responded to what they described as a narco fiesta, a drug-fueled party in a rural area called Tobadito. They arrested a man named Daniel Irene Enriquez Parra, a known narco trafficker connected to a gang based out of the city of Alamos. They found him in a car loaded with an arsenal of weapons. But here's the part that should make you sit up. When police booked the arrest, they detained only 3 companions. The fourth person in the car, Enriquez Parra himself, the actual trafficker, the man with the connections and the product, walked free, despite the weapons, despite the narco fiesta, despite the fact that they had him in their custody red-handed. They kept the 3 nobodies and let the one person who mattered drive away. Jiménez Mota got his hands on the arrest records, the booking paperwork, the inconsistencies in who was charged and who wasn't, and published the story. He showed in black and white that Sonora's own law enforcement had deliberately released an armed drug trafficker while arresting the people around him. The cover-up was right there in the official documents. The police had protected the one man who mattered, and a 25-year-old reporter made that protection visible to the entire state. El Imparcial won the Premio Nacional de Periodismo for that investigation, Mexico's National Journalism Prize, the highest honor in the country for the profession. And the 25-year-old reporter who dug up the story, who pulled the documents, who put the names in print, was now marked. In the weeks before he disappeared, the warning signs were everywhere. About a week before April the 2nd, Jiménez Mota came home and spotted 3 suspicious men waiting outside his house. His mother, Esperanza Mota Martinez, later described them as having military-style shaved heads. Jiménez Mota didn't go inside. He turned his car around and drove away. He reported the men to the municipal police. And the police, the same police force that Jiménez Mota had been writing about, the same force he'd exposed for releasing a narco from custody, treated him as paranoid and refused to take any action. Think about what that means. A crime reporter walks into a police station and says, "3 men are waiting outside my house and I think they're going to hurt me." And the officers on duty look at him and decide he's imagining things. This is the man who just published evidence that their own colleagues protected a drug trafficker. Of course, they dismissed him. There's another detail his colleagues mentioned. In the days before his disappearance, Jiménez Mota told several people at El Imparcial that he was being followed. He wasn't vague about it. He was rattled. The same reporter described by people who knew him as aggressive and fearless was openly telling co-workers he felt exposed. And then came that Saturday night. The meeting with the prison official. The call from the Deputy Chief of the Attorney General's office at 11:04 p.m., the same official who initially lied about having any contact with him. And then silence. There was no ransom demand, no body recovered, no trace of where he'd gone. Alfredo Jiménez Mota vanished completely, and 2 decades later, nobody has recovered so much as a phone or a shoe. The investigation, if you want to call it that, was a disaster from the start. Mexico's federal prosecutor at the time, President Vicente Fox's administration, publicly promised all available resources would be deployed. Fox himself told Jiménez Mota's father, "There has to be justice, and we have to be efficient." And for this I offer all my support. In practice, almost nothing happened. The National Human Rights Commission later said the resources deployed were totally inadequate. Investigators never developed a significant lead. The case file bounced between judicial officials in the cities of Uruapan, Zamora, and Morelia without explanation. The Inter-American Press Association sent its own rapid response unit to Hermosillo within days of the disappearance, interviewed family members, colleagues, friends, and newspaper executives, and produced a more detailed accounting of the case than the government ever did. By 2007, Mexico's Federal Prosecutor General's office told the family that all possible lines of inquiry had been exhausted. 2 years in, they were done looking. No arrests, no suspects named publicly. All lines exhausted. But then came a break of sorts. In January 2007, a municipal police lieutenant named Jesus Francisco Ayala Valenzuela walked into the offices of the CNDH, Mexico's National Human Rights Commission, and gave a statement. He named names. He said former Navojoa Police Chief Luis Octavio Gastelum Villegas, criminal investigators Ricardo Tapia Chan and Pedro Cordova Herrera, local prosecutor Abel Murrieta, and Ricardo Boers, the brother of Sonora's sitting governor Eduardo Boers, were the people behind Jiménez Mota's abduction. Read that list again. A police chief, criminal investigators, a local prosecutor, and the governor's brother. A police lieutenant was sitting in a government office naming members of the state's own power structure as the people who disappeared a journalist, and nothing happened. No one on that list was ever arrested. No one was ever charged. Ayala gave the same statement to the Federal Prosecutor General's office. Same result. Separately, journalist José Reveles reported in his book El Cartel Incómodo that a narco-trafficker named Raúl Gutiérrez Parra ordered a hit squad called Los Güeros to kill Jiménez Mota because his investigations were interfering with the flow of drugs through Sinaloa. Gutiérrez Parra himself was later killed as well. So you have a police lieutenant naming the governor's brother and local law enforcement officials. You have a journalist's book naming the specific cartel figure and hit squad. You have cell phone records placing the deputy chief of the attorney general's office as the last known caller. And you have a 25-year-old reporter who had just exposed the fact that police were releasing drug traffickers from custody. The pieces are sitting on the table. Not one prosecutor, not one judge, not one federal official has ever assembled them into a case. 16 years after Jiménez Mota disappeared, on December 8, 2021, the Mexican government held a public ceremony at Plaza Independencia in Empalme, Sonora, the small town where Jiménez Mota was born. Undersecretary of Human Rights Alejandro Encinas stood before the journalist's parents, José Alfredo Jiménez Hernández and Esperanza Mota, and his sister Leticia Jiménez Mota, and the governor of Sonora, Alfonso Durazo Montaño, and formally apologized. The state, Encinas said, could not guarantee or protect the integrity of Alfredo Jiménez Mota. The federal government was officially saying, on the record, in the plaza where the man grew up, in front of the mother who told reporters her son had been followed and the police wouldn't listen, that it failed him. It's a remarkable thing, a public apology. Heads of state standing in the town where a man was born, telling his mother and father that the government couldn't protect their son. But an apology without an arrest is just a speech. It's an admission dressed up as accountability. And as of right now, more than 21 years after that Saturday night in Hermosillo, not a single person has been charged with the disappearance of Alfredo Jiménez Mota. The case sits before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, co-litigated by the Inter-American Press Association and the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Organization, still waiting for the justice that Mexico has never delivered. Alfredo Jiménez Mota was 25 years old. He'd been a reporter at El Imparcial for 6 months. In that time, he exposed a cover-up so clean and so provable that it won his newspaper the highest journalism prize in the country. He showed the public that the people paid to protect them were protecting drug traffickers instead. And a week before he vanished, he walked into a police station and told the officers someone was outside his house waiting for him. They called him paranoid and sent him home. He went out on a Saturday night to meet a source, called a friend to say he'd see her later, and disappeared into the same silence his stories had been trying to break. 21 years and the ground still hasn't given him up. Case 3. Daniel Pearl, January 23, 2002, Karachi, Pakistan. 4 months after the September 11th attacks, and the country is a nerve center of the global war on terror. Every intelligence agency in the Western world has people on the ground here. Al-Qaeda operatives are moving through the city. The Pakistani government is publicly cooperating with the United States while privately navigating a web of militant groups it has spent decades cultivating. And into this, a 38-year-old journalist from the Wall Street Journal walks straight toward a story that will kill him. Daniel Pearl was the journal's South Asia bureau chief. Before Karachi, he'd reported from London, Washington, and across the Middle East. He played the violin, he was funny, he was the guy in the newsroom people genuinely liked. He'd been based in the region since late 2001 with his wife Marianne, a French journalist who was freelancing her own stories, and they were living in Karachi. Pearl was chasing a specific thread that nobody else in the press corps was following with the same intensity. In December 2001, a British man named Richard Reed had tried to detonate a bomb hidden in his shoe on a transatlantic flight from Paris to Miami. The bomb failed. Reed was subdued by passengers and arrested. And the question Pearl was working on was whether Reed had been trained or facilitated by militant networks inside Pakistan, specifically whether there was a connection between Reed and a radical Pakistani cleric named Sheikh Mubarak Ali Shah Gilani. Pearl wanted an interview with Gilani, and somebody offered to arrange it. That somebody was Ahmed Omar Saeed Sheikh, a 28-year-old British national of Pakistani descent. Sheikh had studied at the London School of Economics. He'd been a competitive chess champion. He also had a history of kidnapping Western tourists in India in the 1990s and had spent years in an Indian prison before being released in a hostage exchange. He was, by any measure, one of the last people on earth Pearl should have trusted. And Pearl had no idea. Sheikh contacted Pearl through intermediaries and offered to set up the meeting with the cleric. The Wall Street Journal later reported that during their communications, Sheikh and Pearl actually developed something resembling a personal rapport. Both of their wives were pregnant at the time. Sheikh's and Marianne Pearl's due dates were close. They talked about that. Sit with the cruelty of that for a second. A man sharing the excitement of expecting a child with the person he is about to deliver into a trap. On the evening of January 23, 2002, Pearl went to the village restaurant near the Metropole Hotel in downtown Karachi, expecting to be taken to meet Gilani. Instead, he was picked up by members of the kidnapping team, at least 12 Pakistanis and 3 Arabs organized into separate cells, and driven to a remote compound on the outskirts of the city. He was taken to a small building where guards chained him to an old car engine bolted to the floor. That was his cell for the next 9 days. An engine block, a chain, and walls. Within days, the world knew Pearl was missing. Emails arrived at the Wall Street Journal and other news organizations from a group calling itself the National Movement for the Restoration of Pakistani Sovereignty. The emails included photographs of Pearl with a gun to his head and a newspaper in his hands. The group demanded the release of Pakistani detainees held at Guantanamo Bay and the delivery of F-16 fighter jets to the Pakistani government. A second email warned Pearl would be killed within 24 hours if demands weren't met. Secretary of State Colin Powell said the United States would not negotiate. Pearl's wife, Marianne, 7 months pregnant, made a public appeal for his release. She spoke directly to the captors. She was calm, she was composed, and behind the scenes, the panic was total. Pakistani intelligence and the FBI were scrambling to find him, working through a maze of militant cells and informants. What most people don't know is that Pearl fought back. On the 6th day of his captivity, he tried to escape. Guards shot him. He was wounded but survived the attempt. For 3 more days, he was held, injured, chained to that engine in a building where he now knew with absolute certainty he was going to die. On the 9th day, February 1st, 2002, Daniel Pearl was executed on camera. A 3.5-minute video was later delivered to U.S. officials in Pakistan. In the video, Pearl speaks directly to the camera. He identifies himself. He talks about his family. And then he says the words that have never left anyone who heard them. "My father is Jewish. My mother is Jewish. I am Jewish. Back in the town of Bnei Brak, there is a street named after my great-grandfather Chaim Pearl, who was one of the founders of the town." Moments later, his throat was cut, and his head was held up for the camera. I won't describe what happened next in detail. It's enough to say that what was done to Daniel Pearl's body after his death was designed to send a message so brutal that it would discourage any journalist from ever following the same trail. His remains were not found for nearly 4 months. On May 16, 2002, Pakistani police were led to a shallow grave on the outskirts of Karachi. The site was on property owned by the Al-Rashid Trust, an Islamic charity the United States had accused of funneling money to Al-Qaeda. Pearl's body had been dismembered into 12 separate pieces and buried in that grave. The person who led police there was Fazal Karim, a member of the banned militant group Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, who had been arrested not for Pearl's murder, but for an entirely unrelated suicide bombing. He was one of the guards at the compound. Under interrogation, Karim was unrepentant. He told investigators he would go out and do it again. He was a Jew, an American, he said. "I feel great to be a part of the revenge against America." Within months, Pakistani authorities arrested Ahmed Omar Saeed Sheikh and 3 accomplices, Salman Saqib, Fahad Nasim, and Sheikh Adil, who were charged with sending the ransom emails. The trial was held first at Karachi's central jail, then moved to a heavily guarded prison in Hyderabad because of security threats. The proceedings were closed to journalists and the public. Sheikh was sentenced to death. The 3 others received life sentences. Pakistan closed the case, and the United States let it go dormant. But the case wasn't closed, not even close. What happened next is one of the most damning indictments of both Pakistan's justice system and American willingness to look the other way. In 2007, a former Wall Street Journal colleague of Pearl's named Azra Q. Nomani, who had actually been staying in the Pearl home in Karachi when Danny was kidnapped, partnered with Georgetown University journalism director Barbara Feynman Todd to launch the Pearl Project. It was a faculty-student investigative reporting effort, 32 Georgetown students working alongside Nomani for 3.5 years, combing through every available record, every witness statement, every piece of forensic evidence in a case Pakistan considered closed. Their report, published in 2011 by the Center for Public Integrity, ran to 31,000 words. What they found was staggering. 27 men were involved in the kidnapping and murder of Daniel Pearl. Not 4, 27. Of those 27, only 4 were ever convicted. At least 14 suspects identified by Pakistani police were never charged and remained free. 5 others were dead, 2 of them killed extrajudicially. The conviction of the 4 men who were tried rested on perjured testimony. Pakistani investigators had pressured a taxi driver to change his earlier account and testify that he saw Sheikh near the restaurant where Pearl was kidnapped. Sheikh was likely not even in Karachi when the kidnapping happened. The prosecution built its case around a lie and ignored evidence from Fazal Karim that could have led to the actual participants. But the detail that should make you furious is this. An FBI agent working the Pearl case was told by his supervisor to stop digging. The exact words, as the Pearl Project reported them, were "let sleeping dogs lie." The FBI, the primary federal law enforcement agency of the country whose citizen was kidnapped and beheaded, told its own people to back off. The Pearl Project also resolved the question everyone had been asking for years. Who actually killed Daniel Pearl? The answer had been sitting in a confession the entire time. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the architect of the September 11th attacks, told FBI interrogators after his capture in Pakistan in March 2003 that he had personally beheaded Pearl with his own blessed right hand. For years, people doubted the confession because it came under duress after Mohammed was waterboarded. But the Pearl Project found corroborating forensic evidence that changed the picture. A technique called vein matching, comparing the pattern of veins visible on the hand of the killer in the murder video to the veins on Mohammed's hand, produced a match. The veins confirmed what Mohammed had said. The 9/11 mastermind personally killed Daniel Pearl. And yet the man convicted and sentenced to death for Pearl's murder wasn't Mohammed. It was Sheikh, the man who organized the trap. In April 2020, a Pakistani court overturned Sheikh's murder conviction entirely, reducing the charge to kidnapping and sentencing him to 7 years. He had already served 18 years. The decision meant he could walk free. International outrage and pressure from the U.S. government eventually pushed Pakistan's Supreme Court to reinstate the conviction, but the case exposed the rotting foundation the prosecution had always stood on. Daniel Pearl's son, Adam, was born in May 2002, 3 months after his father's execution. Marianne Pearl raised him in the knowledge of who his father was and what his father had been doing when he died. Pearl had been chasing a single thread, a connection between a failed shoe bomber and a cleric in Pakistan, because he believed the public had a right to know how these networks operated. He followed that thread into a restaurant in Karachi, expecting an interview, and walked into a trap set by a chess champion from London who talked to him about baby names while delivering him to his executioners. 27 people were involved in what happened to Daniel Pearl. 4 were convicted on perjured testimony. 14 walked free. The man who actually held the knife turned out to be the most wanted terrorist on earth. And the FBI told its own agents to let sleeping dogs lie. He was 38. A kid from Princeton, New Jersey and Encino, California, who grew up to be a reporter and a fiddle player who jammed bluegrass at parties. A husband, a father his son would never meet. And the story he was chasing when he died, the connection between the shoe bomber and the militants of Pakistan, was exactly the kind of reporting the world needed in the months after September 11th. Nobody else was going to follow that thread into the places it led. He did. And the last thing he said on camera before they killed him was his name and where his family came from. Case 4. María Esther Aguilar Cansimbe. November 11th, 2009. The city of Zamora, in the central Mexican state of Michoacán, a city of fewer than 100,000 people, deep in what the Mexican government calls Tierra Caliente, the hot land. And by 2009, Zamora wasn't just hot in temperature. The state of Michoacán was under siege from 2 warring drug cartels. Local governments were collapsing. Police forces had been so thoroughly corrupted that federal authorities had arrested 30 municipal officials and mayors across the state a few months earlier, along with the state attorney general himself, all accused of protecting one of the cartels. The governor's own half-brother was a fugitive on federal drug charges. And in a move that tells you everything about how far things had gone, the entire government of the nearby county of Tansidero, every official, every police officer, resigned en masse that same year, citing fear for their lives. Even doctors and nurses had fled. The state legislature held an emergency session and admitted they didn't know what to do. That's the world María Esther Aguilar Cansimbe was reporting from. Just days after those 30 officials were arrested, 12 federal agents sent in to restore order were rounded up and murdered together. Police stations across the state were being attacked. The federal government sent the Mexican army, and according to journalists working in the state, many of the army units were themselves being corrupted by the cartels within weeks of arriving. As one state reporter told CPJ, the cartels and the government end up being the same thing. And she was doing it from a small rental apartment on a noisy industrial side street in Zamora, where the electricity had just been shut off because the family couldn't pay the bill. Aguilar was 32 years old, a crime reporter with 10 years of experience. She wrote for the local paper El Diario de Zamora and served as a regional correspondent for El Cambio de Michoacán. She covered the police beat, which in Michoacán meant she covered the cartels. She was married to David Silva, a man who understood her world in a way few spouses could, because before they met, he'd been the police chief of Zamora. They'd gotten together 15 years earlier when she was 19, just starting her career on the crime beat, and he was running the department she covered. They had 2 daughters, Frida, age 9, and a younger sister, age 7. And Aguilar was honest. In a state where that was becoming a death sentence, she was stretched thin financially, making payments on a laptop computer and doing work that could get her killed for the kind of salary that can't keep the lights on. But she kept showing up. Here's what was happening to journalism in Michoacán by 2009, and this is the part most coverage of her case leaves out entirely. A senior journalist close to Aguilar later told the committee to protect journalists about a meeting she'd attended in Zamora with several other local reporters. The meeting was led by a key police reporter who was obviously representing one of the drug cartels. This reporter pointed to the other journalists in the room, one by one, and named the monthly amounts they would each receive for skewing their coverage in the cartel's favor. The other reporters agreed. Aguilar refused. She tried to leave the room. The others shouted her down and forced her to stay. She still said no. That refusal, according to the editor who told the story, may have been her fatal mistake. In the logic of Michoacán in 2009, the corrupt journalists and the cartel couldn't allow an honest reporter to exist alongside the arrangement they'd built. A single person reporting the truth in a room full of people being paid to lie is a threat that can't be managed. It can only be removed. Her colleagues told CPJ that most police reporters in Zamora got phone calls regularly from organized crime, telling them how to handle specific stories or ordering them not to write something at all. If a reporter changed their phone number, the cartel had the new number by the next day. The only way that happened, the editor said, was if the police provided it. The cartels and the police were the same machine. There was nowhere for an honest journalist to turn for help. Even the local government was reportedly paying monthly protection money to the cartels. In Zamora, the city that was supposed to protect you was paying a subscription fee to the people threatening your life. And Aguilar kept writing anyway. In the weeks before she disappeared, she published a string of stories that put her directly in the crosshairs of every faction that controlled Zamora. On October 22, 2009, she reported on a military operation near Zamora, in which at least 3 individuals, including the son of a local politician, were arrested on suspicion of collaborating with organized crime. That story named names the authorities wanted, kept quiet. 5 days later, on October 27th, she published a piece on police abuse allegations implicating Zamora's public security chief, Lieutenant Jorge Arturo Cambroni Torres. That story landed hard. Cambroni Torres was dismissed from his position shortly after it ran. When the top cop in your city loses his job because of something you wrote, every officer under him knows your name and knows what you cost them. And then she covered the arrest of a reputed local leader of the cartel, La Familia Michoacana, the dominant trafficking organization in Michoacán. Look at the sequence. In the span of 3 weeks, she wrote stories that led to the firing of the city's top cop, exposed a politician's son for cartel ties, and covered the takedown of a cartel boss. Any one of those pieces could get you killed in Michoacán. She published all 3, and she knew how dangerous it was. Aware of possible reprisals, Aguilar had stopped putting her byline on many of the riskiest stories. She filed them under the paper's name or let them run unsigned. That's a woman doing the math on her own survival and deciding to keep reporting anyway by stripping her name off the work. She did not mention receiving specific threats before her disappearance, her colleagues told CPJ. But in a state where the police and the cartels shared phone records, she didn't need a phone call to know she was exposed. On November 11, 2009, Aguilar was at home in Zamora with her 2 daughters. It was a Wednesday. Her phone rang. She took the call, told the girls she would not be long, and walked out the door. She's not been seen since. She was the first female journalist to disappear in Mexico. Her sister, María del Carmen Aguilar Cansimbe, moved in to take care of the girls. A psychologist advised her to tell the children their mother was on a trip and couldn't call for the moment. But the older girl, Frida, wasn't buying it. She was afraid her mother was lost somewhere and wanted to write her a letter so her mother could find her way back. Her husband, David Silva, described the aftermath to CPJ in a way that stays with you. Every night it's the same until 2 or 4 in the morning, waiting for the phone call, listening for the car to stop on the street. Then if one does, I'm sure it's her coming home. But it never is. Silva pointed out the cruelest part. In Zamora, kidnapping for ransom was common. At any given moment in the city of fewer than 100,000 people, there were roughly 25 active kidnapping for ransom cases, according to a journalist familiar with the numbers. Families waited, paid, and sometimes got their people back. In those cases, someone always made contact. Negotiations happened. Money changed hands. But in his wife's case, close to a month had passed and nobody had called. Nobody had asked for money. Nobody had made a single demand. That silence, for a man who'd spent his career inside law enforcement, told him everything he needed to know. And then there was the investigation, which barely deserves the word. Reporters Without Borders reported that the case file was passed between judicial officials in 3 different cities, Uruapan, Zamora, and Morelia, without explanation, causing delays at every step. The Michoacán State Attorney General publicly promised no impunity and that investigators would pursue the case to its fullest extent. In practice, nothing moved. Her relatives said the authorities never contacted the family. Nobody reached out. Nobody asked questions. Nobody provided updates. The file just bounced from desk to desk while a woman stayed missing and her 2 daughters waited for a letter to arrive. By 2007, the same pattern had played out with 2 other journalists who'd disappeared in the state, José Antonio García Apac in 2006 and Mauricio Estrada Zamora in 2008. The federal prosecutor's office had effectively shelved all of those cases too, saying the lines of inquiry were exhausted. 3 journalists gone from one state in 3 years, and the government's conclusion each time was that they'd tried everything they could think of. Silva, the former police chief, said the cartel's influence in Zamora was so total that he couldn't trust any officer to investigate, honestly. With most of the police here, you don't know who you're talking to, he told CPJ, a detective or a representative of organized crime. And after her disappearance, something else happened that confirms the scope of the silence around her. According to friends and colleagues, not one of the 7 local newspapers in Zamora published a single story about her abduction. 7 papers, 0 coverage. Her colleagues believed the order came from the same people who took her. Write nothing. Make her vanish from the record the way you made her vanish from the street. María Esther Aguilar Cansimbe was the 4th journalist to disappear in the state of Michoacán since 2006. Not one of those 4 cases has ever been solved. A 5th journalist disappeared from the same state in 2010. Same result, in 2024, 15 years after Aguilar vanished, a Mexican court finally acknowledged that her rights to justice and truth had been violated due to investigative negligence. The judge found that the government had failed to conduct an immediate search, had omitted key evidence, and had allowed years-long delays in basic investigative steps. The court ordered measures to address the failures. As of this year, those measures remain unimplemented. The order sits on paper and nothing moves. Reporters Without Borders and the Mexican legal organization Propuesta Cívica have filed formal complaints before the United Nations Human Rights Committee because no domestic institution has delivered anything resembling accountability. She was a woman who covered the police beat in a state where covering the police could get you killed. She refused to take cartel money when every other reporter in the room said yes. She kept her name off the most dangerous stories and filed them anyway. She was making payments on a laptop and couldn't keep the electricity on, and when her phone rang on November 11th, she told her daughters she'd be right back. Frida is in her mid-20s now. Her mother walked out the door that Wednesday, and the door has stayed open ever since. And the letter never got sent because there was never an address to send it to. Case 5. Anna Politkovskaya, October 7, 2006. A Saturday afternoon in central Moscow. The address is 8 Lesnaya Street, a residential apartment building, and a 48-year-old woman is coming home from the grocery store. She's carrying bags, her arms are full. She walks into the lobby, climbs a few steps, and enters the elevator. 24 seconds later, the killer walks out of the building. In those 24 seconds, Anna Politkovskaya was shot 4 times at point-blank range, 3 bullets to the chest, 1 to the head. The gunman dropped a Makarov 9mm pistol and 4 shell casings on the floor of the elevator and left. He'd followed her into the building and waited until her hands were full, until she couldn't defend herself, couldn't even reach for a phone. The timing, the scene, the weapon left behind. Prosecutors said it bore every hallmark of a contract killing, and the date it happened on was October 7th, Vladimir Putin's 54th birthday. That detail has never stopped being significant to the people who covered the case. A journalist who spent 7 years documenting Putin's war crimes in Chechnya killed on his birthday. Coincidence is one explanation. The other is that the date was the message. To understand what Anna Politkovskaya represented and why she was worth killing, you have to understand what she did and what had already been done to her before the elevator. Politkovskaya was born Anna Mazepa in 1958 in New York City. Her parents were Soviet diplomats posted to the United Nations. She grew up inside the system, studied journalism at Moscow State University, and married a television reporter named Alexander Politkovsky. After graduating in 1980, she worked for Izvestia, the official newspaper, and then for Aeroflot, the state-owned airline, writing for its in-flight magazine. That job turned out to be formative. It sent her across the country. In her own words, it showed her the whole of Russia. Before that, she said, she didn't know life at all. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Politkovskaya began the work that would define and eventually end her life. In 1999, she joined Novaya Gazeta, an independent newspaper co-owned at the time by former Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev. The paper was one of the last genuinely independent outlets in Russia, and Politkovskaya became its special correspondent covering the Second Chechen War. For 7 years, from 1999 until her death, she traveled repeatedly into Chechnya and reported on what the Russian military was doing to civilians. Rapes, beatings, murders, disappearances, torture. She documented it in detail, with names and photographs and testimony from the people it happened to, and she published it in a country where publishing those facts was the most dangerous thing a journalist could do. She wrote books. Putin's Russia was published 2 years before her death, and in it, she asked a question that no other mainstream journalist in Russia would touch. She wrote that she often wondered whether Putin was human at all, or a frozen or iron statue. She said she couldn't find confirmation either way. Her other book, A Dirty War, documented the Chechen conflict with the kind of first-hand reporting that required her to sleep in the homes of the civilians she covered, sharing their meals and their fear, because those were the only places in Chechnya where she was safe. They trusted her, absolutely. She was the only journalist they would talk to, because she was the only one who came back. The response from the Russian state was not subtle. In February 2001, while investigating rapes, beatings, and murders committed by the Russian military in the village of Katuny, Politkovskaya was arrested by military security agents in the Vedeno district of Chechnya. They claimed her press credentials weren't in order. They held her in a pit for 3 days. She was given no food and no water. While she was down there, a military officer threatened to shoot her, rape her, and harm her children. 3 days in a hole in the ground, listening to a soldier describe what he was going to do to you and your family. She got out. She kept reporting. She later wrote about the experience with a kind of measured fury that tells you more about her character than anything else could. She deliberately chose not to write in detail about the poisoning, the detentions, the threats. She said these were small things compared to the main issue, which was having the chance to do the work. She was a woman who classified being held in a pit and threatened with rape and murder as a minor inconvenience, because the inconvenience didn't stop the reporting. 7 months after the pit, she received death threats from a military officer she had accused of committing atrocities against civilians. The officer sent an email to Novaya Gazeta promising revenge. Her newspaper and publisher helped her flee to Vienna. She stayed there until December 2001, and then she came back to Moscow and went right back to Chechnya. In 2002, on another trip into the war zone, she was arrested again, held overnight at a military base, and this time subjected to a mock execution. Soldiers stood her up and pretended to kill her. That's designed to break a person. It's designed to implant the certainty that next time they won't pretend. She kept going back. In September 2004, Chechen militants seized a school in the town of Beslan, North Ossetia, taking over 1,000 people hostage, most of them children. Politkovskaya immediately headed for the region to cover the crisis. On the flight, she drank a cup of tea. She became violently ill almost immediately and lost consciousness. She was hospitalized in serious condition and barely survived. Colleagues and investigators believe she was poisoned, deliberately, to keep her from reaching Beslan and reporting on what was happening. The toxin was never identified. The Beslan siege ended in a catastrophic military assault with over 300 dead, most of them children. Politkovskaya never got to cover it firsthand. The tea had seen to that, a pit, a mock execution, a poisoning, and she was still reporting. On October 5, 2006, 2 days before her death, Politkovskaya gave what turned out to be her last interview. It was with Radio Free Europe. She was asked about Ramzan Kadyrov, the Putin-installed leader of Chechnya, a man whose militias were at the center of the torture and disappearances she'd spent years documenting. She called him a Stalin for our times, and then she said something that reads differently now. She said, "I only have one dream for Kadyrov's birthday. I dream of him someday sitting in the dock in a trial that meets the strictest legal standards, with all of his crimes listed and investigated." She was working on a story for Monday's edition of Novaya Gazeta. Her editor, Dmitry Muratov, confirmed after her death that she had several photographs documenting torture carried out by Kadyrov's forces in Chechnya. The story was ready. It was going to run 2 days later. It never ran the way she wrote it. On Saturday, October 7th, she came home with groceries and stepped into the elevator. The killer had been following her, part of a coordinated surveillance operation. Prosecutors later established there were 2 tracking groups, one following Politkovskaya's movements and a second group watching the first group. The operation had been planned with extreme care. The gunman, Rustam Makhmudov, was eventually convicted alongside 4 others in 2014, 8 years after the killing. But justice took a tortured path to get even that far. In February 2009, a jury acquitted 3 of the suspects, including 2 of the Makhmudov brothers. Colleagues of Politkovskaya's at Novaya Gazeta were furious. Political analyst Yulia Latinina, who knew several jury members, said they told her privately they hadn't even considered the possibility that an FSB colonel and a police officer could be involved in murdering a journalist. They simply didn't believe the state did things like that. Russia's Supreme Court overturned the acquittals and ordered a retrial, and the second trial finally produced convictions in 2014. Makhmudov's uncle, Lom Ali Gaitukayev, a Chechen criminal and businessman, was convicted of receiving the order to kill her from an unidentified person and organizing the hit. Both Rustam Makhmudov and Gaitukayev received life sentences. Makhmudov's brothers Jabrail and Ibrahim were sentenced to 14 and 12 years for surveillance and driving roles. Former policeman Sergei Kadzykurbanov got 20 years. A 6th person, former police lieutenant colonel Dmitry Pavlyuchenkov, had already been sentenced to 11 years in 2012 for supplying the murder weapon after cutting a plea deal that required him to fully confess his role and name the mastermind. He never did. Pavlyuchenkov never named the person who ordered the killing. Gaitukayev died in prison in 2017 without revealing who gave him the order. And the official investigation into who commissioned the murder of Anna Politkovskaya went cold. The family's lawyer, Karina Moskalenko, told the Committee to Protect Journalists that the life sentences for the secondary participants were an attempt to avert international attention away from the fact that Anna Politkovskaya's killing remains unsolved. Novaya Gazeta has said the same thing over and over, year after year. The newspaper launched its own parallel investigation after the murder and offered a 25 million ruble reward, roughly 930,000 at the time, for information leading to the mastermind's arrest. The paper's journalists worked closely with prosecutors, helping gather evidence, tracking leads, doing the investigative work the Russian state should have been doing on its own. And still, the person who ordered the killing walks free. The deputy editor, Sergei Sokolov, told Echo of Moscow Radio in 2018, 12 years after the murder, that investigators weren't replying to queries and were not in contact with the family. There's an impression, he said, that the case is being buried in the sand. Gorbachev, who co-owned the newspaper where she worked, called the killing a true political homicide, a vendetta. If you're still watching this far in, you already know what connects every person on this list. They found something, they wrote it down, and the people they wrote about decided the writing had to stop. If these cases are pulling you in, subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Anna Politkovskaya was held in a pit and threatened with rape and murder. She was mock-executed at a military base. She was poisoned on a plane. She was shot 4 times in an elevator while holding grocery bags on Vladimir Putin's birthday. And every one of those things happened because she would not stop writing about what Russian soldiers were doing to civilians in Chechnya. She saw it with her own eyes. She had the photographs, and the people in the photographs, the ones doing the torturing, had friends in very high places. Anna Politkovskaya had a son and a daughter. She was 48. And the story she was going to publish on Monday, the one with the photographs of the torture, was sitting on her editor's desk when the bullets hit her. The story ran eventually in a different form. But the woman who gathered the evidence, who went into the pit and came back, who drank the poison and survived, who faced the mock execution and kept reporting. That woman never got to see her name on the final version. Case 6. José Antonio García Apac. November 20th, 2006. Somewhere on the road between Tepalcatepec and Morelia in the state of Michoacán, southwestern Mexico. It's about 8 o'clock in the evening and the road is dark. No streetlights out here. Mountain roads through cartel country, the kind of route where you keep driving and don't stop unless you absolutely have to. But a journalist nicknamed El Chino, a man his family described as cheerful, someone whose laugh could fill a room, is driving home after closing up the newspaper he founded, and he pulls over to make a phone call home. He gets his son on the line. Could he bring home groceries? He asks. A normal question. A father on his way back to his family at the end of a workday. While they're talking, his son hears something change. There are other voices in the background. Men. They're asking García Apac to identify himself. Then they demand he hang up the phone. And then the son hears the sounds of his father being dragged away from the phone. Scuffling, movement, force being applied to a person. The line goes dead. A teenage boy standing in his house in Morelia just heard his father being taken by strangers on a dark road 200 miles away, and the last words he caught were men ordering his dad to stop talking. That was the last time anyone in the Garcia family heard José Antonio García Apac's voice. He was the founder and editor of Ecos de la Cuenca, a small weekly newspaper based in Tepalcatepec in the Tierra Caliente region of Michoacán. He had a wife named Rosa Isela Caballero and 6 children waiting for him in Morelia. He was calling to ask about groceries, and somebody pulled him off the road, took him, and erased him. To understand why a man running a small circulation weekly in a rural Mexican town was worth disappearing, you have to understand what that paper was doing and where it was doing it. Tierra Caliente is the hot land. It's the rough, mountainous interior of Michoacán, a region so remote and so thoroughly controlled by drug cartels that even government officials had trouble reaching some of the communities García Apac covered. The region was notorious for a cartel called La Familia Michoacana, which controlled drug routes, extorted businesses, and operated with near-total impunity. García Apac's family remembered him as someone cheerful, someone with a laugh that filled a room. People in his community described him as a social fighter, a man who worried about the insecurity of the region and decided to do something about it by building a newspaper from scratch. He reported from places nobody else went, villages that didn't see state or federal authorities for months at a time, places where the cartels were the only governing structure, and people lived under their rules because there was no alternative. And García Apac was publishing what he found. Ecos de la Cuenca ran stories about cartel violence, about score settling between rival trafficking organizations, and about the thing that made him most dangerous of all, collusion between Michoacán's local police, municipal officials, and the drug traffickers they were supposed to be fighting. He wasn't just reporting the violence, he was reporting the partnership between the violence and the state. In the weeks before he disappeared, the paper carried articles about violent confrontations between local drug cartels and what García Apac described as alleged collusion between authorities and drug traffickers, specifically the Zetas, a paramilitary group that had turned from military operations to smuggling and kidnapping for ransom. But his reporting went further than print. In February 2006, 9 months before he vanished, García Apac did something that other journalists in Michoacán considered extraordinarily risky, the kind of thing people in the business talked about quietly because they couldn't believe anyone would actually do it. He compiled a list, not a story, not an article to be published, but a document. A list of Michoacán state officials, including police officers and local politicians who he believed were directly linked to criminal organizations, names, positions, connections. He'd gathered the information from his reporting, from his sources in Tierra Caliente, from years of watching the same officials show up at the intersection of law enforcement and narco-trafficking. And he didn't just file it in a drawer. He drove to Mexico City, hours away, and took it to the federal anti-organized crime squad for corroboration. He was trying to hand federal authorities the blueprint of corruption in his state, the names of the officials making the cartel machine run. His wife later told CPJ that she believed this trip may have backfired. Consider the logic. You take a list of corrupt police officers and politicians to a federal agency in Mexico City. That list has to pass through hands. It has to be logged, reviewed, possibly shared back down the chain for verification. And somewhere in that chain, in a country where, as one reporter put it, the cartels and the government end up being the same thing, the names on the list find out there's a journalist who wrote their names down and tried to hand the paper to federal cops. Michoacán state authorities later told Rosa Isela that they did not follow that lead because there was no record of García Apac's visit to the organized crime office. The federal government said it had no comment on whether the lead was ever pursued. Based on other, unspecified information, authorities concluded that García Apac's case was not connected to organized crime. Let me repeat that. A journalist who publishes stories about cartel police collusion, who personally compiles a list of dirty officials and takes it to Mexico City, who is then dragged off a highway by men who demanded his identity. And the official conclusion is that his case has nothing to do with organized crime. That's the investigation. His wife, Rosa Isla, wasn't satisfied. She told reporters she was in despair over her powerlessness in the face of investigations that went nowhere. She sent a letter to authorities asking why specific leads had been ignored from the very beginning of the investigation, including the existence of a rumored secret cemetery near Tepalcatepec that the police had never visited. She never received a clear reply. The investigation was put on hold 3 separate times. 3 times the authorities looked at the case, decided they had nothing to work with, and set it aside. The third and final hold came in March 2008, just 16 months after the disappearance, officially for lack of new evidence, in a case where the victim's own family had pointed investigators toward a list of corrupt officials hand-delivered to a federal agency, a potential burial site that police never visited, and a phone call in which the sounds of a man being seized were audible to the person on the other end of the line. None of those leads produced new evidence because none of them were followed. The investigation didn't fail. The investigation was never seriously conducted. A veteran reporter in Michoacán who knew García Apac, speaking to CPJ anonymously out of fear for his own safety, put it plainly. How can there be real investigations if so many special interests exist between the cops and criminals? You get the strong sense, he said, that those in power would prefer to see reporters who do their job well just disappear. García Apac had also clashed with the then mayor of Tepelcatepec in the months before he vanished. He'd had confrontations with local officials who didn't appreciate the kind of coverage his newspaper was providing. His wife told him to stop investigating. She told him he was putting his life in danger. But journalism was his passion, Rosicella later said. He wouldn't stop. His disappearance came just days before President Felipe Calderón launched the massive federal military offensive against the drug cartels in December 2006. Michoacán was one of the first states targeted. Thousands of soldiers poured in. It was the beginning of what would become Mexico's open drug war, with all the chaos and bloodshed that followed. And the journalist, who had been trying to document the collusion that made the cartels possible, who had walked into a federal office with a list of names and said, "Here, these are the ones working with the traffickers," was already gone before the first soldier arrived. Reporters Without Borders and Article 19 both classify García Apac's disappearance as an enforced disappearance, meaning the state was either directly or implicitly involved. Witnesses in the area where he was stopped reportedly heard him being interrogated by what sounded like military personnel before the scuffling began. The RSF classification carries a specific legal weight under international law. Enforced disappearance has been recognized as a crime against humanity since 2002. It is defined as the abduction of a person by the state or by persons acting with the state's consent, followed by a refusal to acknowledge what happened. That definition describes García Apac's case with uncomfortable precision. In August 2025, RSF and the Mexican legal organization Propuesta Cívica filed a formal complaint before the United Nations Human Rights Committee, asking it to recognize Mexico's responsibility for García Apac's disappearance and to determine violations of his rights to life, integrity, liberty, and freedom of expression, as well as the rights of his family to truth and justice. Nearly 20 years later, his wife has never stopped. Rosa Isela Caballero took over the editorship of Ecos de la Cuenca after her husband vanished. She kept the paper going, switching from weekly to bi-monthly publication because she was running it alone while raising 6 children and holding the family together. Other journalists in the region told CPJ the paper hadn't skipped a beat, and Rosa Isela made one change to the layout that says more than any verdict ever could. In the upper right-hand corner of every single issue, she placed a passport-sized photograph of José Antonio García Apac. Every edition, every print run, his face right there on the front page of the newspaper he built, looking back at the reader from the place where his name used to appear as editor. She told the BBC, "I don't want them to forget the case. More than anything, I want to know whether or not he is dead." José Antonio García Apac was a man who founded a newspaper in one of the most dangerous regions in the Western Hemisphere because nobody else was willing to cover what was happening there. He reported from villages the government couldn't reach. He published the names the authorities wouldn't touch. He compiled a list of the corrupt, drove it to the capital, and tried to put it in the hands of people he thought could do something with it. And on his way home one night in November, he stopped to call his son and ask about groceries. That's the last thing he said to his family. "Should I pick something up on the way home?" And somebody dragged him off the road and into a silence that has lasted almost 20 years. His newspaper is still printing. His photograph is still on the front page of every issue. His wife is still editing the paper he built, and the secret cemetery she asked the police to visit, the one near Tepelcatepec that she wrote a letter about and never received a reply, has still never been searched. Case 7. Veronica Guerin. June 26, 1996. The Nas dual carriageway just outside Dublin, near a junction called Newlands Cross. Early afternoon, a red Opel Calibra is stopped at a traffic light. The woman behind the wheel is on her cell phone talking to a friend. She's 36 years old, a week from her birthday. She's a crime reporter for the Sunday Independent, the biggest selling newspaper in Ireland. And in the 9 seconds before the light turns green, a white motorcycle pulls up beside her car. The passenger pulls a handgun and fires 6 times through the window. 3 rounds hit her chest, 1 her neck, 2 more her body. She dies almost instantly, phone still in her hand, the traffic light still red. The gunman and the driver speed away. The whole thing takes less than 10 seconds. By the time the light changes, Veronica Guerin is dead in her car at an intersection she drove through every week. To understand how Ireland got here, how a journalist was assassinated at a traffic light in broad daylight in a country where nothing like this had ever happened, you have to understand who Veronica Guerin was and what she'd spent the previous 2 years doing. In over 30 years of sectarian violence in Northern Ireland, not a single journalist had been killed. And now, in the Republic, in peacetime Dublin, a crime reporter was gunned down at a junction she drove through every week. Guerin wasn't born into journalism. She was born in Dublin in 1958, studied accounting at Trinity College, and spent 7 years running a public relations firm. She also did something almost nobody who covers her story mentions. She was an athlete, a serious one. She played on the Republic of Ireland women's national football team, including a match against England at Dallymount Park in May 1981. She also played competitive basketball for Ireland at the international level. 2 national teams, 2 different sports. That tells you who she was. Competitive, physical, and absolutely not someone who backed down. She came to journalism relatively late, starting in 1990 at age 32, writing for the Sunday Business Post and then the Sunday Tribune. By 1994, she was at the Sunday Independent, and she'd found the beat that would define and ultimately end her career: Dublin's criminal underworld. Ireland in the mid-1990s was in the grip of a heroin epidemic that was devastating working-class communities across Dublin. Entire housing estates were being hollowed out by addiction, and the drug trade was controlled by a network of gangsters operating with near-total impunity. The police, the Gardaí, knew who the major traffickers were. The courts knew. Everyone in Dublin knew. But nobody could touch them because Irish law simply wasn't built to seize criminal wealth or dismantle drug empires at the financial level. There was no mechanism for it. The gangsters lived in mansions, drove luxury cars, ran horse farms with pristine paddocks and show-jumping arenas. And the law couldn't explain where the money came from because nobody had the legal tools to follow it. Guerin decided she was going to put names to the money. She didn't write vague pieces about the drug crisis. She went to the criminals' houses, knocked on their doors, and asked them directly how they could afford their lifestyles. She confronted them in person, on their own property, sometimes without an appointment. Her colleagues thought she was insane. The criminals certainly did. In January 1995, someone answered one of those visits with a bullet. A gunman came to her front door and shot her in the leg. She was hospitalized. She recovered. She went right back to work. On a separate occasion, masked men fired 2 warning shots into her home while she and her family were inside. The message was plain. We know where you live. We know where your child sleeps. Stop. The Gardaí assigned her a full 24-hour police escort for her protection. She dropped it. She told them it was hampering her work. She couldn't knock on a drug lord's door with 2 uniformed officers standing behind her. The protection would have kept her alive, and she chose the reporting instead. In December 1995, the Committee to Protect Journalists gave Guerin its International Press Freedom Award, one of the most prestigious honors in global journalism, in recognition of her courage covering Dublin's gangs in the face of direct physical violence. She accepted the award and kept going. Then came September 13, 1995, and the confrontation that sealed her fate. Guerin drove to the Jessbrook Equestrian Center, a horse farm owned by John Gilligan. Gilligan was the most powerful drug trafficker in Ireland at the time. He was importing massive quantities of hashish from Europe and distributing it through a gang that included enforcers, lieutenants, and corrupt contacts. And he'd built himself a sprawling equestrian estate that was impossible to explain on any legitimate income. Guerin showed up at his farm unannounced and started asking questions. How do you afford all this? Where does the money come from? What legitimate business produces this kind of wealth? Gilligan's reaction tells you everything about who he was and how seriously he took her as a threat. He ripped open her shirt, searching for a hidden microphone. When he didn't find one, he beat her. physically assaulted her on his own property, a journalist who had come to his door with questions, and afterward, he called her at home and told her that if she wrote a single word about him, he would kidnap her son Cathal, rape him, and kill her. Her barrister, Felix McElroy, was present when one of those threatening phone calls came in and overheard the threats directly. Guerin pressed assault charges against Gilligan, and that's the decision that, according to testimony that came out in the trials, triggered the murder. Gilligan's gang panicked. He was the only member of the operation with direct connections to the European hashish suppliers. If Gilligan went to prison on the assault charge, the entire drug importation network would collapse. There was no plan B. There was no second person who could make the calls to the suppliers in Amsterdam. Brian Meehan, Gilligan's enforcer, was later quoted saying that Gilligan had said he was going to have something done about her. On the evening of June 25, 1996, the night before the murder, 3 gang members met at the Greenmount Industrial Estate in Dublin: Charles Bowden, Brian Meehan, and Peter Mitchell. Bowden serviced and loaded a Colt Python revolver with 357 Magnum semi-wad cutter bullets. These aren't ordinary rounds. A semi-wad cutter is designed to cut a clean, wide channel through tissue. The gun was prepared with the specific intention of making sure whoever was hit didn't survive. The same day, John Gilligan flew from Dublin to Amsterdam on a commercial flight. He was out of the country before the gun was loaded. That was the alibi. The next afternoon, June 26th, Guerin was driving her Opel on the Nas Road. She stopped at the light, the motorcycle pulled up, and in the time it takes to blink twice, it was over. She was a week from turning 37. About an hour after the shooting, Bowden, Meehan, and Mitchell met on Moore Street in Dublin. Bowden later testified that the meeting was to establish their presence in a public location, placing them away from the scene. What happened next is the part of this story that separates Veronica Guerin from every other case on this list. Ireland didn't just mourn her. Ireland changed. On July 4, 1996, 9 days after the shooting, the entire country observed a moment of silence for Veronica Guerin. People on buses stopped talking. People on trains bowed their heads. People standing on the streets of Dublin stood still. A whole nation paused for a journalist who'd been shot at a traffic light, because the country understood that what had happened to her was a failure of every system that was supposed to protect its citizens from the people she'd been writing about. The investigation into her murder became one of the largest in Irish history. Over 150 people were arrested. The Gardaí tore through Dublin's criminal underworld with a ferocity that hadn't existed before Guerin's death. Brian Meehan was convicted of her murder in July 1999 and sentenced to life in prison. As of 2026, he remains behind bars and has been repeatedly denied early release. Gilligan was charged with murder, but the Special Criminal Court acquitted him due to insufficient direct evidence, despite the judge stating on the record that there were grave suspicions of Gilligan's involvement. He was, however, convicted of trafficking commercial quantities of cannabis and sentenced to 28 years. That sentence was reduced to 20 on appeal, and he was released in 2013 after serving 17 years. 3 months later, he was caught at London's Heathrow Airport boarding a flight to Amsterdam with $296,000 in cash stuffed into a suitcase. The man never stopped. In 2014, Gilligan was shot 3 times at his brother's house in Dublin by gunmen who forced their way inside. He survived, reportedly because he was wearing body armor. He'd been warned by police that his life was in danger. The man who was acquitted of ordering Veronica Guerin's murder spent the rest of his life being hunted by the same world she'd tried to expose. But the most lasting consequence of Guerin's death wasn't a conviction. It was legislation. Her murder forced the Irish government to create the Criminal Assets Bureau, a law enforcement agency designed specifically to do what Guerin had been doing with a notebook and a phone: follow the money. The KAB was given the legal authority to seize assets that couldn't be explained by legitimate income, to freeze criminal wealth, and to dismantle the financial infrastructure of organized crime. It was the tool that had been missing, the one whose absence had allowed Gilligan and his kind to operate openly for years. Since its founding, the Criminal Assets Bureau has seized hundreds of millions of euros in criminal assets. It became a model that other countries studied and adopted. A journalist got shot at a traffic light, and the country built an entire institution to finish the work she started. Veronica Guerin is buried in Dardistown Cemetery in Dublin. Her gravestone is designed to look like a newspaper page, with written tributes from friends and family laid out as articles. Even in death, the format is journalism. Her brother Jimmy has continued to advocate for tougher anti-crime legislation in the decades since, and in a 2018 interview on the anniversary of her murder, he admitted it doesn't get any easier as the years go by. She was an accountant who became a reporter at 32, an athlete who'd represented her country in 2 sports, a mother who was told her son would be kidnapped and killed if she didn't stop writing, and who responded by pressing criminal charges against the man who made the threat. She dropped her own police protection because it got in the way of the work, and on the day they killed her, she was stopped at a red light on the phone with a friend, doing exactly what she always did, going somewhere, working on something, refusing to stop. Case 8. Daphne Caruana, Galizia, October 16, 2017. The village of Bidnija, on the northern end of the island of Malta. It's about 3 in the afternoon. A 53-year-old woman walks out of her family home, gets into a rented Peugeot 108, and drives toward the main road. She's just finished writing. Half an hour ago, she published what would be the final post on her blog, Running Commentary, one of the most widely read websites in Malta. The post was about a libel suit brought by the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff against a political opponent over comments about corruption. And the last line she typed, the last sentence Daphne Caruana Galizia ever published, read, "There are crooks everywhere you look now. The situation is desperate." 30 minutes after those words went live, a bomb planted underneath her rented car was detonated by remote control. The explosive was later identified as TNT. The blast was so violent it blew the Peugeot apart, sent the wreckage spiraling over a stone wall, and catapulted her body into a nearby field. Pieces of the car were scattered across the road and into the surrounding farmland. The force of the explosion was heard across the village. Residents who ran outside found a scene that looked like a conflict zone, not the quiet countryside of a small European island where this kind of violence had never happened before. The FBI was asked to assist with the investigation almost immediately. Daphne Caruana Galizia was dead, and she had known it was coming. 2 weeks before the bomb, she had filed a police report saying she was receiving threats. Nobody acted on it. To understand what made this woman so dangerous to so many people on an island of fewer than 500,000, you have to understand what she'd spent the last 2 decades doing. And you have to understand Malta. It's the smallest country in the European Union. 1 island, 1 city that matters. A population the size of a mid-tier suburb. Everyone knows everyone. The political class, the business class, the judiciary, and the media all overlap in ways that would be impossible in a larger country. Power on Malta is personal. Connections are visible. And corruption, when it exists, is intimate, because the distance between the person doing it and the person covering it is measured in city blocks, not continents. Caruana Galizia operated inside that fishbowl, and she wrote about it with a directness that nobody on the island could ignore. Caruana Galizia had been a journalist for over 20 years. She wrote a twice-weekly column for the Malta Independent starting in 1996, and she ran her blog, Running Commentary, which became one of the most influential and most feared publications on the island. She covered organized crime. She covered drug trafficking. She covered political corruption at every level. And she did it with a directness that earned her not just readers, but enemies in nearly every faction of Maltese public life. She went after the ruling Labour Party. She went after the opposition. She went after business figures, government ministers, and anyone whose public image didn't match the paper trail. Politico, the European political media outlet, named her one of 28 Europeans who were shaping, shaking, and stirring Europe. On an island the size of a large city, she had the reach and the reputation of a national institution, and the powerful people she wrote about treated her accordingly, not with respect, but with litigation. At the time of her death, Daphne Caruana Galizia was facing more than 40 active libel suits. 40. From politicians, from businessmen, from public figures who wanted her writing stopped through the courts because they couldn't stop it any other way. And then came the Panama Papers. In 2016, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists published the Panama Papers, one of the largest leaks of financial documents in history. Over 11 million documents from the Panamanian law firm Mossack Fonseca exposed hidden offshore holdings of politicians, billionaires, and public figures across the globe. And Caruana Galizia went straight for the Maltese connections. What she found was explosive. She revealed that Prime Minister Joseph Muscat's wife Michelle, the country's energy minister Conrad Mizzi, and the government's chief of staff Keith Schembri all held companies in Panama, allegedly set up to receive payments from Azerbaijan through a structure that routed money from the sale of Azerbaijani citizenship and energy deals. The Prime Minister and his wife denied having companies in Panama, but the reporting detonated Maltese politics. It triggered a snap election in June 2017 that Muscat won, but the allegations didn't go away. The European Parliament sent a delegation to Malta on a fact-finding mission about the rule of law, and Caruana Galizia became the most targeted journalist on the island, pursued through the courts and vilified in public by the very people she was investigating. There's one detail that most people covering this case skip over, or mention only in passing, but it matters. One of Daphne Caruana Galizia's 3 sons, Matthew, was a software developer and data journalist working for the ICIJ, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, the exact organization that coordinated and published the Panama Papers investigation. Matthew was part of the team that built the technical infrastructure, making the leaks searchable and usable by reporters around the world. The mother was writing the stories from Malta. The son was building the systems that let journalists everywhere dig through the documents. The Panama Papers weren't something that landed in her lap from an anonymous source. They came through the same organization her own child worked for. That family was at the center of the investigation from both sides, the journalism and the technology behind it. And when the bomb went off, Paul Caruana Galizia, another of her sons, was sitting in a cafe when his brother called to tell him their mother had been killed. After the Panama Papers reporting, the pressure on Caruana Galizia intensified from every direction. The libel suits piled up. 40 active cases is a staggering number for a single journalist, and each one required legal fees, court appearances, and time that could have been spent reporting. The suits were a strategy, not a coincidence. If you can't silence a journalist with threats, you can try to drown her in legal costs and court dates until the reporting slows down or stops. It didn't work. She kept publishing. The threats came in alongside the lawsuits, and 2 weeks before the bombing, she filed the police report. Nobody acted on it. And the island's political establishment, from the Prime Minister down, spent years publicly demonizing her in ways that, in a country this small, amounted to painting a target on her back. Muscat himself called her one of his harshest critics on a political and personal level. That's a sitting head of government on an island where everyone knows everyone, singling out one journalist by name repeatedly from the podium. Then came the bomb. 3 men were arrested and charged in December 2017, 2 months after the murder. Brothers George and Alfred DiGiorgio were convicted. A third, Vince Muscat, no relation to the Prime Minister, pleaded guilty in February 2021. But the real question was always who ordered the killing. In November 2019, Maltese businessman Jorgen Fenech, one of the wealthiest people on the island, was arrested and charged with masterminding the assassination. His trial remains ongoing, and what unraveled from that investigation was a picture of corruption so deep it forced the Prime Minister out of office. Keith Schembri, the Chief of Staff, Caruana, Galizia, had exposed through the Panama Papers, was arrested and questioned in connection with the murder. Energy Minister Konrad Mizzi resigned. The protests in Valletta grew week after week, thousands of Maltese citizens filling the streets of a capital city small enough that you could hear the chanting from one end to the other. Demonstrators carried photographs of Caruana, Galizia and signs reading, "Who ordered the murder?" And in January 2020, Joseph Muscat himself stepped down as Prime Minister, the second European head of government to fall in connection with the murder of a journalist investigating corruption in less than 2 years. But the institutional rot went beyond the cabinet. Consider this. When Caruana Galicia's family asked the Maltese courts to assign a magistrate to lead the public inquiry into her murder, the court assigned Magistrate Consuelo Scary Herrera. The family immediately objected and demanded a replacement. The reason? Sherry Herrera had personally launched legal proceedings against Caruana Galizia while she was alive. The person chosen to investigate the journalist's murder had been suing the journalist. That's what the family was working against, a system so small and so compromised that even the bench couldn't produce a neutral judge. And then there was the police. One of the sergeants assigned to the murder investigation, a man named Ramon Mifsud, posted on Facebook just hours after the car bomb killed Caruana Galizia. His post read, "Everyone gets what they deserve, cow dung, feeling happy." With a smiley face, a police officer assigned to find out who murdered a journalist, publicly celebrating her death on social media the same day she died. Her son Matthew reported the post. That's the institutional environment Caruana Galizia had been fighting against, and the environment her family was now trying to get justice from. In 2021, a panel of 3 former judges completed a public inquiry into the assassination. The report ran 437 pages. It took nearly 2 years to compile, and it did not hold back. The inquiry concluded that while there was no direct proof the government ordered the killing, the Maltese state bore responsibility for Caruana Galizia's death because it had created what the judges called an atmosphere of impunity. Officials knew she was in danger. They knew she had reported threats. They did nothing to protect her, and they had spent years creating the political environment in which her killers could believe they'd face minimal consequences. The board said former Prime Minister Muscat and his entire cabinet should be held accountable. The language was specific and deliberate. The fact remains, the inquiry wrote, that Daphne Caruana Galicia's writing about the intimacy between big business and politics led to her assassination. An atmosphere of impunity. That's the formal finding. A government that didn't protect a journalist it spent years attacking, on an island where the police celebrated her death, where the magistrate assigned to investigate had previously sued her, where 40 libel suits were used as a weapon of attrition, and where the Prime Minister's own inner circle turned out to be the subject of the stories that got her killed. She had 3 sons. She'd been writing about corruption in Malta for more than 20 years, since she was in her early 30s, and in the end, the people she wrote about couldn't stop her with lawsuits, couldn't stop her with threats, couldn't stop her by demonizing her from the floor of Parliament. So they stopped her with a bomb under a rented Peugeot on a Monday afternoon in October, half an hour after she published her last sentence. There are crooks everywhere you look now. The situation is desperate. She was right about all of it, and she died knowing it. Case 9. Jan Kuciak. February 21, 2018. The village of Velika Macha, a quiet farming community about 40 miles east of Bratislava, the capital of Slovakia. It's a dark, cold winter evening, and a 27-year-old investigative journalist is at home with his fiancée, Martina Kushnirova, also 27. They're planning a wedding. They've been together for years, living in this small house in a village where nothing violent ever happens. Slovakia had never seen a targeted killing of a journalist, not once, not in the entire modern history of the country. That changed at this house on this particular night because a hired gunman forgot to put on his mask. The gunman's name was Miroslav Marcek, a former soldier who had served in the Slovak military before moving into private work. He'd been recruited through his cousin, Tomas Sabo, who served as the getaway driver. Marcek's assigned job was straightforward. Go to the house, kill Jan Kuciak, one target, one assignment, get in and get out. But when Marcek approached the front door and knocked, he realized he hadn't put on his balaclava. His face was completely uncovered. And when Martina Kushnirova answered the door and looked directly at him, Marcek understood in that instant that he could no longer leave a witness alive. He shot Kuciak in the chest, then he turned and shot Kushnirova in the head. 2 people dead in their own doorway because a hitman forgot a piece of fabric. When Marcek was later asked in court why he killed Kushnirova, his answer was clinical. He said, "I saw the fact that when I knocked on the door without a balaclava, that it was not possible. Not possible to let her live. Not possible to leave someone who had seen his face." He made a decision about a 27-year-old woman's right to exist based on whether or not he'd remembered to cover his own. Martina Kushnirova had nothing to do with journalism. She wasn't investigating anyone. She wasn't writing stories about corruption. She was an archaeology graduate who worked at a nature reserve. She was planning a wedding. And she died because she opened the door at the wrong second. To understand why someone paid to have Jan Kuciak killed, you have to understand what he'd been writing and who he'd been writing about. Kuciak was an investigative reporter for Actuality.sk, a major Slovak online news outlet. His beat was financial corruption, slow and painstaking document work that doesn't make headlines until it does. And he was digging into something most Slovak journalists wouldn't touch. He was tracing the connections between high-ranking members of the ruling Smer party, led by long-serving Prime Minister Robert Fico, and organized crime networks operating inside Slovakia. Specifically, the 'Ndrangheta, the Calabrian mafia from southern Italy, which had established a quiet but lucrative presence in eastern Slovakia and was doing business with politically connected entrepreneurs. The 'Ndrangheta is considered one of the wealthiest and most dangerous criminal organizations in Europe, and Kuciak was documenting its footprint inside an EU member state. That's not an abstract story about Italian gangsters in a foreign country. That's a story about a European mafia operating inside a European Union member state, with the apparent cooperation of people in the government's orbit. Kuciak was following the money, tracing property deals, agricultural subsidies, business arrangements, and financial flows that linked Fico's political circle to criminal enterprises. He was also looking at how EU funds, money meant for regional development, were being siphoned through companies connected to this network. And one name kept showing up in his reporting: Marian Kochner. A wealthy Slovak businessman with a reputation for ruthlessness, a man who had built a network of connections inside the government, the police, and the courts that gave him a kind of untouchable status in Slovak public life. People in the business and political worlds knew who Kochner was. They knew how he operated, and most of them stayed out of his way. Kuciak did not. He published 9 separate stories about Kochner's business dealings, documenting a pattern of fraud, manipulation, and questionable transactions that touched the edges of the political establishment. Each article added another brick to the wall. And Kochner, a man accustomed to getting his way through intimidation and leverage, watched a 27-year-old reporter build a public record of his activities that wouldn't go away. In 2017, Kochner responded to the reporting by threatening Kuciak directly, verbally, to his face. The threat was explicit enough that Kuciak went to the Slovak police and filed a formal complaint documenting what Kochner had said and asking for some form of protection or investigation. The police took the complaint, they logged it, and then they did absolutely nothing with it. They didn't investigate Kochner. They didn't interview him. They didn't assign anyone to assess whether the journalist who had just published 9 detailed articles about a powerful and well-connected businessman might be in danger after that businessman personally threatened him. The complaint sat in a file. Nobody followed up. Nobody called Kuciak back. And nobody warned him that the man he'd been writing about had connections deep enough to make a phone call and turn a threat into an operation. A journalist walked into a police station with a documented threat from a subject of his reporting, and the system filed the paperwork and forgot about it. 9 articles, 1 threat, 0 action. 4 months after the murders, the investigation began to produce results, and what it revealed about the depth of corruption in Slovakia was worse than the crime itself. Marcek and Sabo were arrested. Marcek eventually pleaded guilty in January 2020 and was sentenced to 23 years in prison. Sabo received 25 years, but the real question, the one that consumed Slovakia for years, was who ordered the killing? Who paid Marcek to go to that house? The answer prosecutors put forward was Marian Kochner, and the evidence looked substantial. Investigators recovered Kochner's phone and extracted thousands of encrypted messages between Kochner and a woman named Alena Zhusova, who prosecutors alleged served as the intermediary who recruited the killers. The messages showed disturbing levels of coordination and familiarity between them, a back and forth that prosecutors argued documented the planning and commissioning of the murder. When portions of the messages were published by Slovak media, the public was shocked by the casual, businesslike tone of the communications. Special prosecutors also acknowledged publicly that Kochner's phone contained communications with representatives of state bodies in the justice system. That's a direct quote from the prosecutors. The man accused of ordering a journalist's murder had been exchanging messages with judges, officials, and people embedded in the institutions that were supposed to be investigating him. Slovakia was stunned. The encrypted messages didn't just implicate Kochner in the murder. They exposed the depth of his reach into the country's judiciary and government. The man on trial for killing a journalist had been texting with the people who were supposed to hold him accountable. The revelation triggered the largest wave of anti-government protests in Slovakia's modern history. Tens of thousands of people filled the streets of Bratislava and cities across the country week after week, demanding accountability. It was the largest sustained public mobilization Slovakia had seen since the Velvet Revolution that ended decades of communist rule in 1989. Young people, students, families, professionals who had never attended a protest in their lives stood in freezing squares holding photographs of Kuciak and Kushnirova. The pressure was enormous and it was sustained, and it broke the political establishment. In March 2018, barely a month after the murders, Prime Minister Robert Fico, who had led Slovakia since 2012 and whose political circle Kuciak had been investigating, resigned. His hand-picked successor, Peter Pellegrini, took over. But the protests didn't stop. They continued through 2018 and 2019, and they reshaped the political landscape permanently. The 2020 elections brought in a new government whose central campaign promise was cleaning up corruption and restoring public trust in institutions. 2 murders in a village house ended a prime minister's career and reshaped Slovak politics. But then the trial delivered a result that felt like the system breaking in real time. In September 2020, the Specialized Criminal Court in Pezinok acquitted Marian Kochner. The 3-judge panel ruled there was not enough evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he had ordered the killing. Kuciak's father, Josef, left the courtroom in tears. Kushnirova's mother, Zlatica, told reporters she had been planning to visit the couple's grave to tell them everyone responsible had been punished. Instead, she watched Kochner walk. The prosecutors appealed. Slovakia's Supreme Court overturned the acquittal in June 2021, finding that the lower court had made several mistakes in assessing the evidence and ordered a retrial. The second trial went through the same evidence again, including a deeper and more thorough analysis of the encrypted messages between Kochner and Zhusova. New expert testimony was introduced. The prosecution asked for life imprisonment. And in May 2023, 5 years after the murders, the Specialized Criminal Court in Pezinok acquitted Marian Kochner for the second time. Same result, same reasoning. It was not proven that he ordered the killing. The victims' families walked out of the courtroom in protest before the judge finished reading the verdict. Reporters covering the trial described the scene as devastating. But in the same verdict, the same court convicted Elena Zhuzova of organizing the murder and sentenced her to 25 years in prison. The woman prosecutors said was Kochner's intermediary was found guilty of arranging the exact killing. Kochner was acquitted of ordering. Zhuzova's guilt was proved beyond reasonable doubt, the court said. Kochner's was not. Kuciak's father stood outside the courthouse and said the only thing there was to say. "I absolutely don't understand this. Zhuzova found guilty, Kochner innocent." The family walked out of the courtroom in protest before the judge finished reading the verdict. Kochner is not a free man today. He was separately convicted of forgery in an unrelated financial case and sentenced to 19 years in prison. But the murder charge, the one that mattered most, the one the entire country had been watching, ended in acquittal. Twice. And the system that failed Kuciak in life failed him again in court. The police who received his complaint about Kochner's threats and did nothing. The justice system whose members were texting with the accused. The court that convicted the intermediary and acquitted the person she was intermediating for. At every level, the machinery that was supposed to deliver accountability produced something that looked more like protection. Jan Kuciak was 27 years old. He was an investigative reporter who published 9 stories about one of the most connected men in Slovakia, reported the man's threats to police was ignored, and was shot in his own home 4 months later. His fiancée, Martina Kushnirova, was 27 years old. She was planning their wedding. She opened the door to a man who forgot his mask, and that mistake cost her everything. The killer is in prison. The intermediary is in prison. The man the evidence pointed to as the person who ordered it all walked out of court twice. And a father who buried his son and his son's fiancée in the same terrible week still can't get anyone to explain how that's possible. Case 10. Azory, Gwanda. November 21, 2017. The Kibiti district in the Pwani coastal region of Tanzania, East Africa, about 120 miles south of Dar es Salaam, the country's commercial capital. This is rural Tanzania. Farming communities, trading centers, red dirt roads, and a landscape that most of the world will never hear about unless something goes very wrong. Something had been going very wrong in Kibiti for 2 years. Starting in 2015, people in the Kibiti, Rufiji, and Menkuranga districts started dying. Not in accidents, not in robberies, not in the kinds of violence that rural communities learn to absorb. These were targeted killings, precise and methodical. The victims included local politicians, government administrators, police officers, ruling party officials, village leaders, and ordinary residents who had the wrong connections or knew the wrong things. The attackers came on motorcycles, usually 2 riders, struck fast, killed their targets with guns or machetes, and disappeared back into the bush before anyone could respond. The killings followed no pattern anyone could publicly explain, and the government offered no coherent theory about who was behind them or why they were happening. Over 40 people were murdered in roughly 2 years in districts that surround Tanzania's largest city. The police conducted sweeping security operations in the area, rounding up suspects and conducting what officials called a mop-up. But the killings continued even during the crackdowns, and almost nobody in the Tanzanian press was covering what was happening in any sustained way, because covering it meant traveling to Kibiti repeatedly, building sources in a community under siege, and becoming a visible presence in a region where visible people were being killed. Almost nobody. One journalist was covering it. His name was Azory Gwanda. He was about 42 years old, a freelancer from Mwananchi Communications Limited, the media company that publishes 2 of Tanzania's most widely read newspapers, Mwananchi and The Citizen. Gwanda lived on a small farm near Kibiti with his wife, Anna Pinoni. He wasn't a big city reporter parachuting in for a story. He lived there. These were his neighbors being killed. These were his roads. And every week, he filed another story for the papers about another murder, another official found dead, another police officer ambushed on a motorcycle. He was the first and for a long time, the only journalist chronicling the Kibiti killings consistently. That made his reporting essential. It also made him the one person in the press whose name the killers, whoever they were, would have known. On the morning of November 21st, 2017, at approximately 8 a.m., 4 men in a white Toyota Land Cruiser arrived at a trading center in Kibiti, where Gwanda sometimes worked from a shared office space. They picked him up. Sources who later spoke to CPJ on condition of anonymity said he may have gotten into the vehicle voluntarily, possibly believing it was a meeting with a source or an official. 2 hours later, at around 10 a.m., the white Land Cruiser stopped at the farm where Anna Pinoni was working. She was 6 months pregnant. Gwanda was sitting in the back seat of the vehicle, flanked by men she didn't recognize. He called to her through the car window. He asked her for the keys to their home. He told her he was going on an emergency trip and would be back the next day. That was it. No explanation of who the men were. No details about where they were going. No introduction, no reassurance. Just a request for the house keys, spoken through a car window to a pregnant woman standing in a field, and a promise to return. Pinoni handed over the keys. The Land Cruiser drove away with her husband sitting between strangers in the back seat. She stood there and watched the vehicle disappear down the road. When Pinoni went back to the house that evening, she found it had been searched. Papers were scattered everywhere across the floor. Someone had gone through their belongings methodically while Gwanda was gone, or while he was being taken, and looked for something specific. Whether it was his notes, his reporting files, his source contacts, she didn't know. What they were looking for, whether they found it, nobody has ever been able to say. Gwanda didn't come home the next day. Pinoni waited. She tried his phone numbers. All of them were unreachable. She waited another day. Then, on November 23rd, she reported him missing to the Kibiti police. A case file was opened, Kibiti RERB 11496-2017. The police wrote down the details, and that was effectively the last meaningful action anyone in the Tanzanian government took on the case. Mwananchi Communications, his employer, didn't learn he was missing until November 30th, 9 days after he vanished. Nobody from the police or the government notified them. The company's managing director, Francis Nanai, issued a public statement on December 4th demanding the authorities act. Mwananchi organized a press conference on December 7th and launched a media campaign with the hashtags #WhereIsAzory and Bring Back Azory, trying to put public pressure on a government that showed no interest in finding one of its own citizens. The Tanzania Editors Forum chairman, Theophil Makunga, said at the time that the disappearance appeared to involve evil intentions. How can someone disappear for 17 days without a trace, he asked, if there aren't evil intentions involved? The government's response was a study in institutional indifference. In July 2018, Home Affairs Minister Kongi Lugola told reporters that the government had no business investigating the case. No business. A journalist vanishes while covering a string of murders in a region the government itself acknowledged as dangerous, and the Home Affairs Minister says it's not his problem. Lugola later suggested Gwanda might have simply run off, abandoned his pregnant wife, his farm, his career, his life, and walked away voluntarily. That was the official theory from a cabinet-level official. The international press freedom community pushed harder. The Committee to Protect Journalists ran a sustained campaign demanding answers, keeping Gwanda's name in circulation through social media, public statements, and direct appeals to the Tanzanian government. In November 2018, CPJ sent 2 of its representatives, Angela Quintal, the organization's Africa Program Coordinator, and Muthoki Mumo, its Sub-Saharan Africa representative, to Tanzania to investigate Gwanda's disappearance on the ground. They were evidently making inquiries about Gwanda's case and his whereabouts. Within hours of arriving and beginning their work, both journalists were themselves detained and interrogated by Tanzanian authorities. The people who had traveled from another continent to ask questions about a missing journalist were treated as threats by the same government that claimed to be investigating the case. The detentions made international news and drew condemnation from press freedom organizations worldwide, but they also sent a message to anyone inside Tanzania who might have been tempted to look into Gwanda's disappearance on their own. Then came the moment that, if this were fiction, you wouldn't believe. On July the 10th, 2019, nearly 2 years after Gwanda vanished, Tanzania's Foreign Minister Palamagamba Kabudi appeared on the BBC's Focus on Africa program. A reporter asked him whether the government had done enough to find Azory Gwanda. And Kabudi, almost in passing, as part of a broader answer about violence in the Rufiji region, said this: "The state is dealing with all those who have unfortunately died and disappeared in Rufiji. It was very painful for someone who was doing his job to pass on." Pass on. The Foreign Minister of Tanzania had just told the BBC on camera that Azory Gwanda was dead. No press conference, no formal announcement, no investigation results shared with the family, no body recovered. A cabinet minister mentioned a journalist's death the way you'd mention a scheduling conflict, wedged into a sentence about regional security, and moved on. The reaction was immediate and furious. CPJ, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and press freedom organizations around the world demanded the Tanzanian government provide a detailed account of how it knew Gwanda was dead and what had happened to him. The government's response was to backtrack. The next day, Kabudi issued a clarification, saying his reference did not mean that Azory Gwanda is confirmed dead. He walked it back. A foreign minister told the BBC a journalist had died, and then the next morning said that's not what he meant. As of October 2021, government spokesman Gerson Mnangagwa told reporters the government hasn't gathered significant information about Azory Gwanda's whereabouts. Security organs are still investigating the matter. 4 years in, the official position was that the investigation was ongoing and had produced nothing. Gwanda's disappearance happened against the backdrop of a broader crackdown on press freedom in Tanzania. Under President John Magufuli's government, newspapers were shut down. Restrictive media regulations were imposed. Journalists were harassed and arbitrarily detained. The message from the state was clear: reporting that embarrasses the government comes with consequences. And a freelance journalist who had been filing stories about a series of unsolved murders in a region where the government's own security forces were conducting operations. A journalist whose disappearance the government first ignored, then blamed on the victim, then accidentally confirmed as a death, then denied confirming, was the most vivid illustration of what those consequences looked like. The One Free Press Coalition, a group of over 30 major international news organizations including Reuters, the Financial Times, the Washington Post, and Time, placed Gwanda on its list of the 10 most urgent press freedom cases in the world. His name and the hashtag #WhereIsAzory circulated in newsrooms and on social media across continents, and still, nobody in Tanzania has provided a single verified piece of information about what happened to him. Anna Pinoni gave birth to their child after Gwanda vanished. She raised the baby on the farm near Kibiti, in the same house that was searched the day he disappeared, in the same district where over 40 people had been killed by motorcycle assassins. Her husband had been the only journalist brave enough to cover. She has never been told whether her husband is alive or dead. No official has ever sat down with her and explained what the investigation found, because the investigation has never found anything, or at least nothing the government is willing to share. She has never received a body, a report, an explanation, or an apology. Azory Gwanda was a freelance reporter who lived where the story was, filed his copy every week, and covered the murders nobody else would touch. He got into a white Land Cruiser on a Tuesday morning in November, called to his pregnant wife through the window, asked for the keys to the house, and told her he'd be home tomorrow. The house was ransacked. The phone went dark. A foreign minister said he was dead on the BBC and took it back the next morning. And the government that was supposed to find him said it had no business looking. That was nearly 9 years ago. Nobody has been charged. Nobody has been held accountable. Nobody has even confirmed whether he's buried somewhere in the red soil of Rufiji or still breathing in a place the world can't see. The only thing the record shows for certain is that Azory Gwanda went to work one morning and never came back, and that the country he served has never once treated his disappearance as something worth solving. 10 journalists, 10 stories they refused to abandon, and the people who wanted those stories buried made sure the journalists were buried with them. Thanks for watching. Click here to see our next video.